The room didn't smell like grief. It smelled like expensive leather, old money, and anticipation. My father, Robert, was already checking his reflection in the mahogany table. My mother, Linda, was texting under the surface. They were not mourning a father. They were waiting for a wire transfer. Mr. Sterling, the family lawyer, didn't open a folder. He didn't clear his throat. He simply reached into his breast pocket and slid a single crisp $10 bill across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of me. There was no check, no zeros, just Alexander Hamilton staring up at me. For Chloe, Sterling said, his voice flat, the sum total of her inheritance. My brother Brandon snorted first. Then my mother covered her mouth, but the laugh escaped anyway. My father just shook his head, offering me a look of mock pity. They thought it was a prank, a final senile joke from the old man. I sat there frozen, my hands trembling under the table, while the people who shared my blood laughed at my humiliation. Interactive CTA. Before we find out what that $10 actually meant, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I want to see who's awake with me right now. My pulse didn't even spike. Panic is a structural flaw, and I had reinforced my walls years ago. I didn't push the table over or scream about the years I spent sitting by my grandfather's hospital bed while they were vacationing in the Alps. In that moment, I realized something cold and absolute. I had spent my entire life trying to buy their approval with affection, with loyalty, with my own dreams. But the market had crashed. I reached out and picked up the $10 bill. The room went quiet, waiting for the breakdown, waiting for the drama they could recount at dinner parties. I held the bill up to the light, checking the watermark like a jeweler inspecting a diamond. Price of admission, I said softly. My mother's smile faltered. Excuse me. It is the price of admission, I repeated, my voice steady. To be free of you people, it is a bargain. I folded the bill, neatly tucked it into my blazer pocket, and stood up. I didn't look at my brother. I didn't look at my parents. I turned my back on the entire Vance dynasty and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Chloe, sit down, my father barked, his voice dropping into that CEO register that terrified his employees. Don't be dramatic. I kept walking. My hand was on the brass handle when Mr. Sterling's voice cut through the air like a gavel. Actually, Sterling said, standing up, Miss Vance, please remain. The rest of you are dismissed. I stopped. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Dismissed, Brandon laughed, standing up. Sterling, we haven't even gotten to the real assets yet. The real estate portfolio, the manufacturing shares. Cut the theatrics. There are no other assets for you to discuss, Brandon Sterling said. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at me. The reading of the public will is concluded. Please vacate the premises immediately, or security will escort you out. The confusion on my parents' faces was the first genuine emotion I had seen from them in years. They sputtered, they threatened, they looked at me with accusing eyes as if I had orchestrated this. But eventually, the shame of being escorted out by guards was too much of a risk for their reputation. They left. When the heavy doors clicked, shut, the air in the room changed instantly. The humidity of their greed evaporated, replaced by the cool, sterile silence of the law office. My legs finally gave out, and I sank into the nearest chair. Mr. Sterling, what is going on? Why did he do that? Sterling didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the wall behind his desk and pressed his hand against a panel I hadn't noticed. A biometric safe hummed and popped open. Your grandfather was a man of construction, Chloe Sterling said, pulling out a thick, leather-bound book. He knew that before you build a skyscraper, you have to test the soil. You have to know what can hold weight and what will crumble. He placed the book in front of me. It wasn't a legal document. It was a journal. That $10 wasn't an insult, Sterling said gently. It was a trap, and they walked right into it. He looked at me, his eyes sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He told me that if you threw the money back, or if you cried, or if you begged, the meeting would end here. But if you took it with dignity, if you accepted the insult without losing yourself, then I was to give you this. He tapped the leather cover. Welcome to the real inheritance, Chloe. My fingers traced the cracked leather cover. It smelled like cedar and stale tobacco smoke, the scent of the study where I used to hide while my father hosted cocktail parties downstairs. I opened it, expecting a letter. Maybe a sentimental apology for the mess he had left behind. But Arthur Vance didn't write letters. He wrote reports. The pages weren't filled with prose. They were columns, dates, times, actions. It looked less like a diary and more like an audit. I ran my finger down the first page. October 14th, 2019. I read aloud. My voice sounded small in the large room. Admitted to Sinai Hospital. Chest pains. Underneath the date, there were two distinct sections. Section 1, Robert and Linda. Sent a bouquet of lilies. Assistant called twice to ask for a prognosis timeline regarding the merger. Section 2, Chloe. Arrived at 10 p.m., stayed overnight in the chair. Read me the architectural reviews from the Sunday paper. I flipped the page. December 25th, 2020. Christmas at the estate. Section 1, Brandon. Gifted a bottle of scotch, retail value $400. Spent 20 minutes asking about the estate tax implications of the new property. Section 2, Chloe. Brought homemade soup. Sat by the fire. We talked about the old ironworks factory for 3 hours. I stopped reading. My throat felt tight, but not from sadness. It was the shock of recognition. For years I had thought my grandfather was asleep during those visits. I thought he was too medicated to notice who was holding his hand and who was checking their watch. I was wrong. He hadn't been sleeping. He had been taking inventory. He kept score, I whispered. He called it the invisible ledger, Sterling said, leaning back in his chair. He told me once that people like your father view relationships as transactions. They think they can buy affection. But Arthur believed that care is the only currency that actually appreciates in value over time. Sterling pointed to the book. Your family assumed that because they hold the title of family, they were entitled to the dividends. But they haven't made a deposit in this account in 20 years. I looked down at the handwriting. It became shakier toward the end, the ink spots darker where the pen had rested too long. But the clarity of his mind was terrifying. He had watched them perfectly. He saw the greed masked as concern. He saw the ambition masked as duty. And he saw me, not as the failure who played with old buildings, but as the only person who actually saw him. Turn to the back, Sterling instructed. I flipped past years of entries, hundreds of hours of my life cataloged in black ink. Past the holidays I spent alone with him while my parents were in Aspen. Past the weekends, I skipped gallery openings to make sure he was eating. Pasted onto the final page was a bank statement. While your father and brother were obsessing over the Vance Pinnacle Tower, Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave, Arthur was quietly liquidating his personal holdings. He sold the vacation homes. He cashed out the bonds. He moved his private equity. My eyes scanned the numbers at the bottom of the statement. The figure was so large, it didn't look real. It looked like a phone number. He moved it all into a blind entity, Sterling explained. He called it the Shadow Trust. He told me that he wanted to divest from the people who were waiting for him to die and invest in the only person who helped him live. I stared at the number. It wasn't just money. It was validation. It was an objective, quantified proof that I hadn't been invisible. So, Sterling asked, a small smile playing on his lips, are you ready to see what you really inherited? The ironworks was my sanctuary. It was a crumbling, century-old brick factory on the edge of the river district that the city had forgotten. The windows were shattered and the roof leaked, but the bones were good. Solid steel beams, hand-laid masonry, things built before planned obsolescence became a business strategy. I was 20 feet up on a scaffold, scraping layers of lead paint off a support beam when the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake, it was diesel. I looked through the broken skylight and saw them. 3 yellow excavators with the Vance Global logo stamped on the side were rolling into the courtyard. Leading the convoy was a silver Porsche, my brother Brandon. I climbed down the ladder, my boots hitting the concrete floor with a heavy thud. By the time I walked out into the sunlight, Brandon was already leaning against his car, checking his phone. He looked like he was dressed for a yacht club, not a demolition site. You're trespassing, I said, wiping brick dust from my hands. I have a lease on this building until the end of the year. Brandon didn't even look up from his screen. Had Chloe. You had a lease. He finally slid his phone into his pocket and smiled. It was the smile of a predator who knows the cage door is locked. The city council held an emergency vote this morning. Something about structural instability and public safety hazards. They condemned the property at 9 a.m. Vance Global acquired the deed at 9:15. He gestured to the massive machines idling behind him. The exhaust fumes were already filling the courtyard, choking out the smell of the river. We need the space for the overflow parking for the Pinnacle Tower. It turns out billionaires don't like walking more than 1 block to their offices. You can't do this, I said, my voice rising. This building is historic. I filed the preservation papers months ago. Papers require money to process, Brandon laughed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet that cost more than my car. And considering your current net worth is, what was it, $10? He stepped closer, invading my personal space. He smelled like mint and arrogance. Here's some advice, little sister. Take your $10, go to a hardware store, buy a hard hat. Because when these claws start swinging, I don't want you getting hurt. Mom would be upset if her troubled daughter had an accident. Troubled, I asked. Brandon just tapped his phone. Check the news. I pulled my phone out of my back pocket. My notifications were blown up. A link to a Business Insider article was at the top, shared by Linda Vance. Vance family announces restructuring daughter steps back for mental health reasons. I read the first paragraph. My mother was quoted saying that I was taking a much-needed sabbatical to focus on personal wellness after the stress of my grandfather's passing. She painted me as fragile, unstable, someone who needed to be handled, not listened to. They weren't just taking my inheritance. They were dismantling my reputation. They were bulldozing my career before I could even lay the first brick. You have an hour to clear your trash, Brandon called out, walking back to his car. After that, it all goes into the dumpster. I stood there, surrounded by the roar of the engines. I looked at the building I had spent 2 years saving. I felt the vibration of the excavators in the soles of my feet. They thought they were burying me. They thought this was the end of the story. But I touched the pocket of my jeans, feeling the sharp corner of the leather journal. They had brought heavy machinery to a demolition. But I was about to bring a nuclear weapon. I burst into Sterling's office, covered in brick dust and adrenaline. I didn't wait for his secretary to announce me. I slammed my hands onto his desk, leaving smudges of grit on his pristine paperwork. They're tearing it down. I choked out my breath, coming in short, sharp bursts. Brandon is there right now with the excavators. They condemned the ironworks. You have to file an injunction. We need a judge. Right now. Sterling didn't jump. He didn't reach for the phone. He carefully capped his fountain pen and looked at my dirty hands. Sit down, Chloe, he said calmly. I don't have time to sit, I shouted. They gave me an hour. I need to stop them. We aren't going to stop them with a judge, Sterling said, his voice level. And we certainly aren't going to stop them with a physical confrontation. You're an architect, Chloe. You know that if the foundation is rotten, you don't fix the roof. You condemn the structure. He stood up and walked to the whiteboard. He picked up a marker and wrote a single number 10. Why did you take the $10, Chloe? He asked. I stared at him, confused. Because it was the price of admission. To get away from them. Legally speaking, Sterling corrected, you accepted a bequest. By physically taking that money and walking out without filing a formal contest within 48 hours, your family also accepted the terms. He drew a circle around the number. It is called a no-contest clause combined with an acceptance of assets. When they laughed and when they let you take that bill, they legally affirmed that Arthur Vance was of sound mind. They validated the will. They walked right into the trap. Sterling turned back to me. They can't sue to overturn the secondary inheritance without voiding their own bequests. Your grandfather locked them out of the courtroom before they even knew there was a trial. That is great, I said, pacing the room. But that doesn't stop a bulldozer that is currently parked on my life's work. Brandon has the deed. He has the city council in his pocket. He has the deed to the property, Sterling agreed. But he doesn't have the authority to authorize the demolition. He is the CEO of Vance Global, I snapped. Of course he does. He is the CEO, Sterling nodded, but he answers to the shareholders. Sterling walked back to the safe and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. It was a stock certificate, but it looked different from the ones my father used to frame on his wall. The Shadow Trust doesn't just hold cash, Chloe. Arthur spent the last 5 years quietly buying back the Class A voting shares of Vance Global. He bought them through shell companies. He bought them during the dips. Sterling slid the paper toward me. This certificate represents 51% of the voting rights of the company. You aren't just a beneficiary. As of this morning, you are the majority shareholder. The room spun. I looked at the paper. My name wasn't on it yet, but the power was. 51%. It was a mathematical absolute. You don't need a judge to stop Brandon, Sterling said, handing me a pen. You don't need to beg him as a sister. You need to order him as his boss. He placed a document on top of the stock certificate. It was a corporate cease and desist order. This revokes the demolition authorization effective immediately, Sterling said. It also freezes all asset transfers pending a board review. I looked at the pen. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy certainty. I wasn't the girl hiding in the study anymore. I was the one holding the pen. I picked it up and signed my name. The ink flowed dark and permanent. Send it, I said. And tell Brandon if he scratches a single brick, I'll liquidate his pension. I waited for the phone to ring. I expected Brandon to call, screaming. I expected my mother to text begging. I sat in Sterling's office, watching the second hand sweep around the clock face, feeling the 51% stock certificate burning a hole in the desk. The phone finally rang. Sterling picked it up, listened for 10 seconds, and then placed the receiver down gently. He didn't look triumphant. He looked grim. "They aren't stopping," he said. "I signed the order," I said, standing up. "I own the majority vote. If they ignore me, that's corporate negligence. I can fire the entire board." "They know that," Sterling said, "which is why they just filed an emergency motion with the SEC. They are claiming that your cease and desist order constitutes fiduciary sabotage. They are arguing that the ironworks demolition is critical to the solvency of the Vance Pinnacle project." He slid a tablet across the desk. A news ticker was already running Vance Global stock dips as heiress attempts to block billion-dollar project. "They are spinning this," I said, scrolling through the legal threats. "They're saying that the Pinnacle Tower is too big to fail. That if I stop the parking lot construction, the tower loses its occupancy permit, the stock crashes, and the company goes bankrupt. They're holding the entire company hostage. They are betting that you won't blow up your own inheritance," Sterling said. "They think you care about the money. They think you'll back down to protect the stock price." I sank back into the chair. They were right. I couldn't bankrupt the company without hurting thousands of employees. My parents had built a fortress of money so high that they were untouchable. "I can't win," I whispered. "They have the leverage. The tower is worth $2 billion. My factory is worth nothing." "The tower is worth $2 billion, Sterling corrected. "But a building is only as valuable as the land it sits on." He opened the safe one last time. There was one document left inside. It was old, yellowed at the edges, smelling of dust and history. "Your father and brother were so arrogant when they built the Pinnacle," Sterling said softly. "They didn't want to pay the capital gains tax on purchasing the land from your grandfather. So they convinced Arthur to do a ground lease." He placed the document in front of me. It was a deed. "They built their $2 billion monument to ego on rented dirt," Sterling said. "Arthur Vance retained the fee simple ownership of the land. And now, so do you." I stared at the map attached to the deed. The bold red lines didn't outline the ironworks. They outlined the city block where the Vance Pinnacle stood. "Read Clause 14, Sterling instructed. I squinted at the fine print. "Termination on default. In the event that the lessee engages in any act of moral turpitude, criminal negligence, or illegal destruction of adjacent property." I read, my voice trailing off. "Attempting to demolish a historic building with a falsified city order constitutes criminal negligence," Sterling said, a rare shark-like grin spreading across his face. "By attacking the ironworks, they triggered a default on the ground lease." I looked up at him. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "They don't own the land," I said. "No," Sterling said. "They are tenants, and they just violated their lease." I picked up the document. It felt heavier than the stock certificate. It felt like a weapon. "So I don't need to sue them," I said, my mind racing. "I don't need to fire them." "No," Sterling said. "You have a much more powerful option." He handed me a red stamp. "You can evict the skyscraper." The boardroom at the top of the Vance Pinnacle was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling glass, 40 stories up, looking down on the city like gods on Olympus. My father sat at the head of the table, flanked by high-priced lawyers. My mother and Brandon were to his right. They looked comfortable. They thought they had won because they had the bigger building. "This little tantrum ends now, Chloe," my father said, tossing a thick file onto the table. "We've filed for an emergency injunction against your cease and desist. The judge will sign it within the hour. You can't stop progress with sentimentality." Brandon leaned back, spinning a pen. "And we're counter-suing for corporate sabotage. By the time we're done, that $10 isn't just going to be your inheritance. It's going to be your net worth." He flicked the $10 bill, the same one I had left in my pocket, toward me. It landed in the center of the table, a prop for their cruelty. I didn't pick it up. I didn't even look at it. "You are right," I said, my voice cutting through the air-conditioning hum. "I can't stop you from building, but I can choose where you build." I plugged my laptop into the room's AV system. The massive screen behind my father flickered to life. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a deed. "What is this?" my mother asked, squinting. "That," I said, standing up, "is the ground lease for this building." "We know what it is," Brandon scoffed. "Grandfather leased the land to the company to save on taxes. It's a standard arrangement." It was standard, I agreed. Until this morning. I clicked a button, zooming in on Clause 14. The text was highlighted in red. Clause 14, termination on default. The lessee, that is Vance Global, forfeits all rights to the land if they engage in criminal negligence or illegal destruction of adjacent property owned by the lessor. I looked at Brandon. The color was draining from his face faster than a failed IPO. I am the lessor, I said coldly, and by falsifying city records to demolish the ironworks, you triggered a default. That is a technicality, my father stammered, standing up. You can't enforce that. It is not a technicality, Robert. It is a contract, one you signed. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table. And here is the reality of your situation. I own the dirt this building stands on, and as of 10 minutes ago, you are trespassing. The silence that followed wasn't like the silence in Sterling's office. It was the silence of a bomb that had already gone off. This is the builder's paradox, I said, delivering the lesson my grandfather had wanted them to learn. You spent 20 years building as high as you could because you wanted to be seen. Grandfather built deep because he wanted to last. You forgot that a skyscraper without a foundation is just a tomb in the sky. Chloe, please, my mother said, her voice trembling. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, clawing fear. We're family, this building. It's everything. If we lose the lease, the company collapses. Our pensions, our reputation, everything. We can work this out, my father pleaded, his hands shaking. We can give you a seat on the board. We can fund the ironworks restoration. Name your price. I looked at them. The titans of industry, the people who had laughed at me for saving a $10 bill, now they were begging for scraps. I don't want a seat on your board, I said. I want your resignations. What Brandon whispered. All of you. Effective immediately. You resign, you keep your pensions, and you walk away. If you refuse, I execute the eviction notice. I seize the building, and I sue you personally for the breach. I slid a folder across the table. It contained 3 resignation letters typed and ready. They looked at each other. They looked at the lease. And then one by one, they picked up the pens. They signed away the empire they thought was their birthright. When they were done, my father looked up, defeated. What are you going to do? I looked at the $10 bill still sitting in the center of the table. I reached out and slid it back to him. Keep it, I said. You're unemployed now. You're going to need it more than I do. The sunlight in the ironworks was different than the light in the boardroom. It was warm. It filtered through the restored skylights, illuminating the exposed brick and the rows of drafting tables where young architects were working. It wasn't a factory anymore. It was a community trust. A space for people who wanted to build things that mattered, not just things that sold. I walked to my office in the corner of the old foreman's room. On the wall, I hadn't framed the stock certificate. I hadn't framed the deed to the skyscraper. I had framed the envelope, the plain white envelope that the $10 had come in. I sat down at my grandfather's old drafting table and opened the leather journal. I turned to a fresh page. March 12th. Project launched. The foundation holds. I smiled. My parents had spent their lives trying to leave a mark on the skyline. They didn't understand that the most important things you build aren't made of glass and steel. They are made of choices. They thought they were burying me under that $10 bill. They forgot that I was a seed. If you believe that true legacy is about character, not just currency, share this story. And tell me in the comments what is one foundation you are building in your life that money can't buy.